Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, this is it. It's the final Friday before we get into the election campaign here in Ontario, and that will happen by all accounts on the 4th day of May, which puts us in the middle of the week next week. So we have the round table of Avengers here assembled. Sabrina and Angie from the Queen's Park Observer, John Wright from Maru Public Opinion, and Keith Leslie. You hear and see him on CH Television. Was busy yesterday, stick handling all of the depth of the new budget. Although, I guess, Keith, to your point, there was a lot in there, but nothing new, based on how all of this was sort of trotted out in the weeks, prior to yesterday's tabling of the budget.
Weeks and months. I mean, this was really, in large part, not just a campaign platform, but a summation of what the Tories have announced in the previous year. So there's an awful lot of big-ticket items that have been announced locally, and they were all summed up in the budget. But really, very, very little new. That seniors' home care credit, so if you're over 70 plus and you need to buy, a walker or other equipment to help you stay at home, a hospital bed, that type of thing, you can apply for a tax credit for that. But everything else had pretty much been announced, leaked out by the government. It's kind of surprising to me in many ways that they have such big revenues, and yet they're still going to increase the deficit. They're not going to balance it in their next term, even when the Financial Accountability Officer said it could be done within a couple of years. They're going to increase spending 5% a year over the next 3 years, even as revenues keep going up. That is not what you would call a small c fiscal conservative budget in any way, shape, or form, but it is one designed to get you elected, especially if your theme is get her done, like Larry the Cable Guy. I mean, the finance minister must have repeated that we're the government that gets things done like a dozen times yesterday in his news conference. He just kept saying it. We build things, we get her done. It was almost laughable how he kept pivoting back to that point when people would ask, well, why did you spend $1.3 billion less on education last year than you budgeted? Well, we built things and we got the HEPA filters, and there was just a lot of nonsense. This, Dave, I disagree. I know the official start of the budget will be next Wednesday. The campaign will be next Wednesday. The campaign was started when the budget was tabled. They shut the legislature down at Easter, said it's not coming back until budget day. No, on budget day they say we're not coming back at all. This is our platform. And to have the finance minister, Bethlen Falvey, say we're going to have the people of Ontario pass this budget, not the legislature. That's not how it works. I'm sorry, but that's just not how it works. And then when he refused to commit to bringing the same budget back in, that just made it as clear as mud to everybody that this is nothing but a campaign document until, of course, the Premier's office clarified, oh, no, that's the one coming back. Well, someone should have told the finance minister, because he had like 6 opportunities. He was even asked, yes or no, will you reintroduce this same budget if you're reelected? And his response was, well, it may be a yes or no question to you.
Of course it is.
I could go on, but my feeling my colleagues want to also comment.
Well, I just want to kind of crunch the numbers here for a second, because when you look at $19.9 billion deficit this year, and if you do the translation in terms of, what that Canadian dollar today is worth versus what it was worth, let's say in 1991, when Floyd Logren stood up and tabled a budget in the legislature, something that resembled, close to $10 billion in 1991 dollars. Right now, his budget would be less. His deficit, that is, would be less than what they tabled yesterday. So all of a sudden, Floyd Logren looks like the fiscal conservative in this mix. John, I just think it becomes one of these things where we talk so much about the deficits and the debt and everything else, and I know you and I and the rest of us have talked about the reckoning that's coming. But quite frankly, I don't think people give a rat's rectum about any of those numbers, because we just keep piling on the dough and we just keep piling up the deficit and the debt.
Well, there's a few things to say about this. First of all, it's probably the first fully costed platform I've ever seen. I mean, there it is. You didn't get one in the last campaign from the Conservatives, and now you got it for sure. It can be gone through forensically. Secondly, I always think tactically when it comes to these things as opposed to anything else. And what I've learned over the last many years of doing this stuff is if you have something that's really, really big, you have to narrow cast what it means. Now, you got to make it small. So big equals small. If it's small, meaning that you've got a slogan or something, you talk about process. So you make it big that way. This budget is huge, and I don't get the defining element for everybody. Like, I do understand get her done. I'm not really sure what that speaks to me. But I also then relate it to what's going on in the public domain right now. We have gas that's going to go to $2 to $2.10 this summer a liter. Okay, so let's put aside the fact that we got all this revenue cranking through. We've got the Bank of Canada looking at taking interest rates up to 3%, which could happen fairly soon, which is going to jeopardize a whole lot of people out there in terms of slim margins on everything from housing to anything they want to get. We've got a cost of living and an inflation issue going on here. And that is the most important issue to people out there. And that is the most important issue for the campaign. And that is the most important issue for most of the leaders to debate. And what we're getting is this huge, great big thing that says we're spending more money, but we're spending it on all this stuff, maybe not narrowing in on what is important to you, the taxpayer, or for just homes. So like I look at this and say, I'm not really sure the launch of this has been done in such a way that it kind of narrowcasts what this is about, and it ties it directly to what the issues are of the day. And we may see that in a campaign. But it just strikes me that when you do these big announcements, people will forget them in the next 2 weeks. I mean, this will all be churned into an election campaign, which will become very local, will become defined by each week of the campaign in terms of how it's fought out. And this great big mammoth thing will be behind us. They've already announced it. We saw that with the Trudeau government. I mean, they announced a whole lot of stuff, and then everybody, before the federal election campaign, it just kind of drifted away. It's gone. So I wonder what the effectiveness is going to be. So I don't think that we've seen yet. I said this months ago. I don't think that we've seen yet what the key issue is going to be during this campaign. But I can tell you, if we get into $2 to $2.10 to $2.15 a liter, which is coming, Dan McTagg certainly predicted it today, I think we're going to be having a different kind of discussion. And I think that is the cost of living is going to be heard at the doorstep, and about housing and about those meat and potato things more than they're going to be about, long-term highway growth and stuff like that.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but first, Sabrina, when we talk about what's in this budget, I think it's just as important to say what's not in this budget. And I thought, your assessment in the Queen's Park Observer today, you talked about, what was in question period yesterday. There was a long list of things that the Tories had promised: hallway health care, all of those things that they were going to attack. They were going to get at making it more affordable for the middle class, whatever the middle class is these days. But there's a long list of things that aren't in there, including support for the autism families and long-term care. Nothing explicitly in there. And what I didn't see, and I wasn't in the lockup and watched it closely, but I didn't get a sense that there was anything in there that took a lesson from COVID-19 and said, because of what we've gone through in the last 2 years or so, we're going to put this on a path to make sure that if and when this happens 5, 10, 15 years from now, there's going to be a mechanism in place to make sure that we don't have the stumbling we had in the last 2 years. So it's great that we're building big things, but I think there was enough on the plate already that's not in the budget. Is that enough to create a wedge for opposition?
Well, I think that, the timing of the budget, and because there's a lot of goodies in there, it does make it really tricky for how the opposition parties can react to this. You mentioned question period. It was just this long list from the opposition NDP MPPs going through. I think they crunched the numbers. 37% of the promises made in 2018 from Doug Ford have not been kept. The PCs have their own spin on that. But, you're right. I think no one's really talking about the pandemic, none of the parties. And not too long ago, maybe a couple of months ago, we were wondering, if the election was going to be essentially a referendum on Doug Ford's handling of it. I think anecdotally, people seem to be fairly okay, willing to give him another shot. the vibe that I've been getting from people is he's done his best, but even the opposition parties aren't really talking much about that. Keith mentioned, the finance minister being rather cagey on whether or not this would stand if the Ford government is reelected with a second mandate, if this budget will be the budget. The staff later on said yes, but Andrea Horwath essentially called it a bait and switch, and that was her line. I think we're going to hear more from the Liberals and Stephen Del Duca about how Del Duca is competent, Ford is not. It's going to be a lot of work to remind people about some of the mistakes and try to capitalize that. I guess it remains to be seen if that's going to actually work. But I think in terms of some of the pivot that we've seen from the Ford government, it's a wonder, what 4 years difference can make. Ford swept a majority in 2018, promising to cut the gravy, as he sometimes likes to say. He was railing against the Wynne government about their spending, and now he's boasting about being a yes man. Record high budgets, almost $200 billion that they laid out yesterday, and it's I think a lot of good news in there, and you can kind of see a little bit from what we saw in the budget who they're trying to target. There's so much in there for motorists. The temporary cut to the gas tax. And fuel tax, I should say, some vague promise to look at auto insurance rates, highways. There's a lot of stuff that's going to target drivers in particular. And we know that there's a lot of drivers in the GTA, the 905 area. Those are heavy with a lot of seats and can make or break a majority. So I think that's kind of my takeaway from this is you can kind of, maybe assess who the Ford government is trying to target here. And like Keith mentioned, there's not a lot new. A lot had already leaked out, had been announced in the months leading up to this week. And, the Ford government's not the only government that has done that type of thing. But I think the underlying message might be it's status quo. It's steady as she goes. Give us another shot. Let's not rock the boat right now. And I think maybe that's kind of folks might be feeling A-okay about that.
Well, and I guess, we talked about this morning on John Moore's show, and the whole idea of what does it mean now to be a conservative. I mean, to Sabrina's point, John, we're talking about targeting, a specific part of the demographic as opposed to somebody of a political stripe anymore. The brand of the conservative in Ontario is not what it used to be. You can't compare what Doug Ford is to what Mike Harris was, or Ernie Eves for that matter. And he really is, you talk about all the initiatives that they focused on the North, for example. They're really going after the NDP core and constituency in Northern Ontario. So all of a sudden, we don't have an obvious political stripe anymore. We're talking about, to your point, making sure that we're hitting the emotional button that's going to engage voters.
Yeah, you nailed it, Dave. I mean, I think, again, you go back to when the Premier said some many months ago that Mr. Trudeau and and the Ford government, in fact, were dealing with the same constituents. He made that very, very clear, and it's aimed primarily at the 905 and then at some of the other regions, that these are not necessarily hard-driven, red meat conservatives at all. These are people who are overlapped into those sides. I mean, sides of the political sphere. I mean, even look at, the unions that the Ford government has catered to and now gone on side. I mean, we don't have a hard divide as, Keith and you and I might remember Frank Miller. I mean, holy geez, to even think about where they were back in those days and bring it out to today is just so starkly different. So I think that, they have clearly looked at the 905, looked at a handful of ridings around the province and said, this is where we can make some gains. You have to also look at the polling right now, which has not changed all that much. The Premier and his party are sitting at about 37% overall, 37%, which is enough for a majority. But it then comes down to individual ridings where, depending upon what polling you're looking at, either the Conservatives are slightly ahead or there's a tie. in that area. So there will be some hard-fought battles, but I don't think it's going to be ideologically fought. Not like things that we've seen before. And you have to look nowadays to the Liberals federally and how they've blurred the line with the NDP, and now you have to look with the Conservatives, how they've softened and gone to the middle. It's very different than the federal Conservative campaign, which has gone, very hard.
Yeah.
And this is the Ford campaign going right up the middle for many of these things. So,
well, that's it right there, isn't it? This, for the past 4 years, has not been a progressive Conservative branded government. The brand is Ford Nation.
Yeah.
And it's very much a pragmatic government. If I need to spend more to get reelected, I'm going to spend more to get reelected, and I'm going to push off balance in the books till after another reelection. That's just not Conservative values at all. That's Doug Ford values, and he's going to, Sabrina talked about, he believes motorists are his target audience, and that's absolutely the highways is a huge focus of this. But again, to him not being your typical Conservative, Leuna, the construction union, has come out and endorsed him and put out a video saying the Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca is not a leader. This is a union endorsing the Premier for re-election. Something as well Sabrina mentioned I wanted to touch on. First of all, in the budget, there was nothing about autism, a file they have royally screwed up, and they should have made some effort there at least. No increase in ODSP for people on disability supports payments, $1,169 a month. Still, that's what they're trying to live on.
That's
absolutely criminal. And they know that invested dollars there will just pay back in so much, not just a better standard of living for those people. They might actually be able to afford food, but it pays back. They don't bank their money. They spend their money right back out at trying to survive, trying to live. That's shameful. The auto insurance thing. The government sounds like it's just taken the lobbyists' verbiage and let them write. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to give consumers choice so you can tailor your insurance product to you and lower your prices. Well, we all know how you lower your rates with tailoring the product for you. You lower your coverage. Yep. And that's okay if you're willing to take that risk. But there comes a point where the catastrophic coverage is capped. And when you need a lifetime of catastrophic coverage, $1 million does nowhere. So whatever these limits are, this is industry jargon. This sounds like we're addressing auto insurance rates. You are not. You may be able to lower your rates by lowering your coverage, and that's a pretty risky way to go. So there's a lot of things in this budget that are designed to make the Conservatives look good, make them look like they're doing more. But we're putting even more money into highways than we said in the last budget. Well, where's the actual costed figures for the 413, for the Bradford bypass? They're still not there. And all the competitive issues. So we still don't know what the real budget figures there. We just know that this government is hell-bent on building more highways. And fortunately, though, they're also putting a lot of money into the electric vehicle industry, and that is balancing some of that off. And they're going at keeping the jobs there. The other thing I found in the budget that really surprised me was that housing starts are going to go down.
Really?
Yeah. Housing starts are projected to go down.
Holy cow. Okay, missed that entirely. I mean, when we get into some of these bigger numbers, though, and you talk about the reckoning, Sabrina, I heard people saying, okay, well, if you want this to work, we're going to have to start talking about, well, what are we going to cut? What are we going to get rid of? And my answer was, well, if we got rid of poverty, we'd save $33 billion a year in the province. And I realized that you can't do that outright. But if you got rid of half of it, there's $15 billion that we could be spending elsewhere on other things, whether it was autism or long-term care. That's a big number. And to Keith's point about the disability pension there, that in and of itself only makes the problem worse when you hold that number down.
Yeah, I think it was Reagan, right? Like a conservative, you might say, that was pumping up their version of a basic income, universal income, and the NDP and the Liberals have talked about bringing that back. And when Doug Ford was kind of pressed on it at a recent press conference, he said his old line that the best way to help these folks is to get them a job, but what about the folks who actually can't work? And we all know just under $1,200 a month, that really doesn't get you much. Like, you can barely keep a roof over your head in Toronto. So I think we have seen calls for those rates to raise, of course, but I don't think there's going to be much movement on that from the Ford government. Certainly not in this budget. And, you know, they canceled the basic income experiment. The Liberals had, planned and had even gotten started with. So I think, you know, that was a real loss, some data that might have fueled some of the policy on that. And, you know, you're right, like to Keith's point, that it's not just giving out free money. You know, there's evidence from other jurisdictions that you know, this kind of, that money is going back into the economy. You know, these people who need these, need these services and need this, basic income, they're using it to, either go back to school, that type of thing. So I think, you know, that was a real missed opportunity there. And it's another way for the opposition parties to kind of come in and say, here's what we're going to do. And I think we are hearing that a little bit from the NDP more about the people who the Ford government is leaving behind, autism as well. So I think, it's more about what's not in this budget that I think, is kind of, maybe more of the headlines that we should be paying a bit more attention to.
So, John, when we talk about what's not in there, and, you keep coming back to that cohort, the 18 to 64-year-old, I mean, they're not seniors and they're not kids anymore. And those two at the extremes end up being the focus of most government programs. It was in there for seniors this week, in terms of, increased benefits for those medical costs, etc. There's also more in there for families. Now, I get that they're trying to do something for people who make less than $50,000 a year, but still, that's a tax credit. It's not a tax cut. It's a nuanced difference, but it's not the same as having money in your pocket. So that group that you've talked about so much that feels disaffected, I don't see them represented in here at all. And this might come back. I don't know if that's the stumbling block for the Ford government.
I want to say two things. Number one, you're absolutely right. Again, to echo what I said before, there's a cohort of, the 18 to 34, maybe the 18 to 40 group that's even more acute to, what's going on in cost of living and interest rates and never being able to get a home, carrying student debt. I mean, in one way, you can kind of brush them all off and say, well, that's the NDP and Liberal territory. I don't need to go in that direction. On the other hand, as we've just now said, if you want to get people on board, this government is straddling political lines. And there are going to be a lot of people hurting over the next year as the inflation rate continues to go up and we get all kinds of other issues like housing not addressed, and, things like that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, I want to double back much to the point that when you bring in a great big budget like this, and it's so big you can't kind of grab onto it, it just washes over people. I can't I can't overstate that enough. It just kind of goes over, and after the talk shows are done of the day, it's on to the next thing, right? And they're talking points after that. What I was a bit surprised at was that the opposition parties were not as prepared as I expected them to be. I mean, Keith, you were in the lockup, but before you were there, you kind of suspected what was going to be in this budget. You knew that it was going to be not passed in the legislature, as we all did. And I want to go back to something in my career that I did a long time ago. Back in about 1985, I actually worked in an offshore campaign. I actually worked in a campaign in Bermuda. Can you believe that? So the United Bermuda Party was where I went, and headed up by Premier John Swan at the time. And they were in a minority situation, and I remember hearing the phrase for the very first time. Two of us were going down advising the government on how to deal with the circumstance, and I heard it for the first time, and it was, hoist the budget and go to the people. Hoist the budget and go to the people. To which around the cabinet table they said, oh, we don't do that sort of stuff. It's not proper. And they ended up coming back with a minority in the election instead of going on the platform. So again, this is abnormal. You don't hoist a budget and go to the people usually. So what we've got now is something that's abnormal. And I thought that coming out of the gates, there could have been a very significant definition of what that budget meant, because it isn't defined. It's just this big glob of money where the opposition could have just said bribe. bribe, or heartless. Like they could have coalesced around a single word to define what that is. And to the last part of that, I remember back in 1988 when the Mulroney campaign, in the final 2 weeks of the campaign, got into some problems on the free trade debate. And I remember, after the main debate for one of the debates, the whole Tory ship went over on one side. Alan Gregg was involved in deciding what they were going to do. And I remember it very, very clearly because that was the Friday and lasted the weekend. And then on the Monday, they hit back and they used the word liar. Liar, liar, liar. And it went everywhere across the board. And it put the other people on the complete defense. And it moved Mulroney into the next category for the debate, which he then nailed John Turner on. So there was a period of time where these big issues are defined by one word. It cuts through like a knife. And I don't see that from the opposition parties. What I see them now is down in the weeds debating about, Andrea Horwath on Friday talking about racism and, like way, way, way down in the weeds as opposed to sort of defining what this government is all about in one word and then taking it and using the campaign to say that's what this is about as opposed to, anything else. So I think it was a missed opportunity. It's a good thing for the government, but they still have yet to be defined by doing what they've done with this budget.
To your point, the Andrea Horwath's best line or most quoted line that I've seen from her in the budget reaction was a bait and switch budget. That was fed to her by the reporter in the question. Do you see this as a bait and switch budget? And she responded, yes, I see this as a bait and switch budget. There must be a real budget. So we've literally fed the best line that she had of the day. That said, I thought they were wise to basically say, budget, we've heard all this before, and just attack, go on the attack. And they've had 4 years, they didn't do this. I thought her response overall was good, but you're right, they didn't have it coalesce into one thing that could just jump on it and hammer home. They should have had something way better, way more prepared. And as I say, the most quoted line that she has was fed to her by the reporter.
Well, the only other
does
thing
that mean that we're just going to kind of float through this campaign? I realize there's some big issues here. I realize that there's a lot of money on the table, but are people going to sleepwalk through the campaign? Because right now, I heard some of the pundits this morning saying, well, if things hold, he might get 71 seats, Doug Ford.
Well, what really bothers me about this whole budget aspect of this, the way they've handled this, used every possible government ploy to their advantage here, is you have a majority government. You had zero intention of taking this budget into the legislature for a vote to be passed by the members of the legislature, which you could have done. And then why would you not do that? You made this just completely politicized, on top of adjourning the House from Easter and then, saying, okay, well, you know what? Monday, Tuesday next week, we're not sitting then either. We'll just have the election start on Wednesday. Here's our platform. Talk about that between here and Wednesday. It's just so completely over the top. I know other governments would use things to their advantage as well. That's just done. But this one was so blatant. I've never seen one to the point where, with a majority, you don't even attempt to bring it into the House and have a little debate. They could have had 2 days of debate, 2 night sittings. They were had night sittings previous to the Easter break. They could have had a couple more, had some reasoned debate on this. Zero debate in the House, and then to say we're going to have the people vote on our budget. As I said, that's not how it's done, and that just feeds the cynicism in politics.
Yeah, I see all of these points. We have to also say that the government or the political party of the Conservatives have some things in hand already. They've got a platform that they've got out through the budget. It's all costed. You've got it there, so you may not agree with it, but they can go to doors and say, we've got this for Mrs. Glutz, and, Mr. Smith, and there you go. Like, we're covering this off. They've got their theme. They've targeted the 905. So they've got a constituency that they've determined is going to, echo the votes that they need. Also, I think the other thing is that they've got, the former Wynne government, Liberals. Like, that's all that we're talking about nowadays when it comes to the Liberals. We're not talking about Del Duca. He's virtually unknown, so they're defining him going into the campaign. So the government has some strengths when they go into this campaign. There's no question about it. But to your point, Dave, I don't know a campaign where anybody's ever really sleepwalked. I mean, sometimes you get them rustled in the night to, from sleeping, and they come away and they look at things and then they go back to sleep again. But I suspect that during the next many weeks, some things are going to happen. One example. Okay. So the Tories have said that they're not going to send in debaters into certain local constituencies to have debates. Keith, you said there's nothing in it for autism. Well, guess what happens when you have a Tory show up and you get all the autism parents who are protesting out the front door? So on one hand, you can see tactically how that's the right thing to do and say, look, we're not going to do that. We'll have a leaders debate. That's where everything is done. On the other hand, we're now into a bubble campaign. So it's bubble, bribe, bait, and switch. I mean, there's the 3 Bs, right? It's defined in an easy way. I'm not really sure too many people on the street know what bait and switch means, but you do know what bubble is. You do know what bribe is. You do know what those other things. So, as I said, there's a very fine line here between the government doing the right campaign for them to reap these votes in the 905 and over the next number of weeks. You and I know, somebody says something locally or something happens that comes out that all of a sudden it just shifts the campaign and you're fighting on a completely different terrain. So I think I think by having this huge budget with all that stuff in it leaves it open for a wedge issue to just slice right through all of this and pivot. Or not. So I'm going to cover my bases that way.
Well, but
or not.
Even if that were to happen, and I wouldn't suggest that that's not an issue. If we get into that point, though, John, we look at the possibility of that wedge being a reason why say a returned Ford government would come to the legislature, late in the summer or early in the fall again to say, well, circumstances have changed. So I know we said this in, April, but because of this, and that, and the things that we observed during the campaign and the things that have happened over the last, number of months, we're really going to have to start taking a lot of this stuff off the table, and we're going to reconfigure that whole fiscal plan. That's what's going to happen.
Well, we've also seen the Ford government get to work real quick. Have an election, call a house, do a few things, although in the last stage it was the corner office with Dean French calling the shots, and that didn't work out so well. But the reality is that they got to work right away, and then they took the summer off. Then they blew out of there. But there's a good argument to be made that if they get a majority, they come in and put an interim budget in place. They can kind of say, we're going to pass it.
For sure.
We're going to take pieces out of this, and we're going to do it right now, and we'll leave the rest for the fall or something like that. Do it and get the hell out of town for the summer.
Yeah, I guess, certainly that's a line that any government can play. I think the Ford government has kind of already done that a little bit, pivoting from the stuff they were saying in 2018, and then the pandemic hit. It's kind of a convenient political excuse, of course, not downplaying, all the hardships and tragedies that we've been through in the last 2 years. But politically speaking, it kind of provides an easy out. They could use the line that we heard such and such at the doors, we're going to tweak the budget. So I guess it does remain to be seen. And as was mentioned earlier, a lot of what's already been announced, what is in the budget, the Ford government not only needs a second mandate, but maybe even a third mandate, to balance the books. A lot of the healthcare funding, is stretched over 10 years, that type of thing. So, I think that there's what was also missing is kind of like, something innovative, something new and fresh. Like, I think people tend to vote for something or against something. And it's not too late. The Ford government can still come out, or, the Conservatives could still come out and put something there. But I thought, at least Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca kind of had a strong point when he said there's a lack of ambition here. And that's why it feels like it's, not a time to rock the boat. Maybe coming out of the pandemic, recovery, that type of thing. So I'm curious, if this might lead to a bigger debate. I know Democracy Watch has talked about, accountability measures to make sure that, governments that are elected keep their campaign promises, maybe some fines in there if they don't stick to it. But I guess that's also why we have elections every 4 years.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't want to rock the boat if you're in Schitt's Creek, right? I mean, that's kind of where we are.
The Liberal leader, Del Duca, did something else this week that I thought really could help pivot to an election issue when he said the Liberals, like the New Democrats, would nationalize the long-term care. They would get the profit takers out of long-term care. That could become a real issue, and it's one that the Ford government certainly doesn't want to talk about because it takes us right back to their handling of COVID, especially the first wave when 4,400 people died in Ontario long-term care homes because there was basically zero protection for them. This issue, and the Ford government says, well, we're building lots of new long-term care homes. Yes, you're building homes with 200 and 300 beds. Is this what we're looking for in the future? I think the whole long-term care issue could absolutely be a pivotal one in this election, especially now that we have the Liberals siding with the NDP. So we have the two opposition parties on a very distinct path, and the Ford government absolutely not going to go for getting rid of the profits in long-term care.
All right, so lots to talk about and lots of time to talk about it between now and the second day of June. And we'll be here to do that. So once the writs are drawn up and we're officially in election mode, we will be kicking this thing into high gear, and we'll be in your inbox on a daily basis in some form or fashion. So thanks for joining us. This is On the Ledge, the Ontario Politics Podcast. I'm Dave Trafford with Keith Leslie, John Wright, and Sabrina Nanji from the Queen's Park Observer. Enjoy your Friday. This is an Eye Contact production.